in a medium-term perspective, there are what I describe as the persistent yet mounting crises. There is jobless growth, there is persistent poverty, there is rising inequality. And in a long-term view, there are the quiet, almost silent crises of the economy in India, in agriculture, in infrastructure, in education, and now, I believe, in industrialization, because we are witnessing the beginnings of deindustrialization in India. Now, the interesting thing is that just as the crisis in the economy is interwoven with the politics in polity and society, which has been spoken about, the crises in the economy that straddle different time horizons are closely interconnected. And it is not as if we have to address each crisis in its respective time horizon. We have to address each and every crisis here and now, because the period in which they will resolve themselves are much longer than we think they are. Now, first, and very briefly, I want to say, simply to set the record straight, that there is an impending macroeconomic crisis. We cannot wish it away. Theory and history both suggest that macroeconomic crises are triggered almost inevitably by unmanageable balance of payment situations. And therefore, the external sector is the proverbial Achilles heel of an economy in crisis. It precipitates in different forms. Plummeting exchange rates, a run on the currency, runaway inflation, capital flight, and so on. But it is often triggered by the external sector. And if we look at that reality, the balance of payment situation in India is indeed fragile. In 2012-13, the balance of trade deficit, the difference between merchandise imports and exports, was 10% of GDP. $200 billion in a GDP of $2 trillion, 10%. The highest it's ever been, the highest of any developing or emerging economy in the present conjuncture. And in spite of the benefit of remittances at 75 billion last year, and software exports at 70 billion last year, which financed this trade deficit, the current account deficit is still close to 4% of GDP. And this morning paper's report that in the first quarter of the current financial year, it is 4.9% of GDP. Now, we cannot wish away this reality. We have to borrow that much abroad, or get non-debt creating capital flows up to 5% of GDP to sustain this. Now, the pattern of financing of this is really unsustainable, because it has relied in the past on non-debt creating capital flows. But last year, Indian firms invested as much abroad as foreign firms invested in India. So net FDI was zero. Portfolio investment in the first half of this year, the outflows have been much greater than the inflows. The problem is A, in the size of the deficit, and B, in the pattern of financing it, because it relies on volatile capital flows. Now, when you embrace global finance with such enthusiasm, you're bound to suffer when there are ebbs and when there are flows. And this is no strategy of financing a deficit. Nobody knows more about this than my former colleague and the present chairman, the dangers of living with the ebbs and flows of global finance. But the real problem, of course, is that the underlying, I was surprised that Bimal felt there was no crisis. I believe the underlying fundamentals are a cause for worry. There is the persistent inflation that Prem Chah has talked about. There's a balance of trade deficit that is much too large for comfort. Okay? China has a trade surplus of 8% of GDP. Brazil has a trade deficit of 2% of GDP. And despite the blessing of software exports and remittance inflows, we have a current account deficit that is much too large by any standards and certainly unsustainable with the pattern of financing we have chosen to adopt. Of course, there are the underlying macroeconomic imbalances, that it does represent a situation where the income of the economy falls short of its expenditure, where investments of the economy exceed its savings. And these are reflected in the current account deficit. The answer, Benu asked at the beginning, does not lie in cutting expenditure alone to adjust. You have to increase income too. The answer lies not only in using foreign capital to finance investment or cutting investment, it lies in raising savings. Now, there are comparisons to be made with 1991. There are similarities and differences, but in many ways, it is a situation that is just as bad, if not worse. The elections to come later this year and early next year promise to make this task of managing the crisis more difficult than we might think in the first instance. Okay? Now, having said that, let me turn to what I believe are India's real crisis. This is something that may or may not come. If it comes, it will have nasty consequences. It could be managed with wisdom and dexterity, but I don't. These rates of growth have not transformed into a corresponding well-being of people. And you might well ask the question, growth for whom? And there are three dimensions or three manifestations of this problem. First, that increases in output reflected in growth have not been reflected in increases in employment. Employment elasticities have, which are sort of, the proportionate increase in employment divided by the proportionate increase in output, which was something like 0.6, 0.7 until the late 70s, have in the last 5 years collapsed to near zero, both in agriculture and in manufacturing. And I believe that this is the biggest failure of the economy in the era of markets and globalization, because employment is the only institutional mechanism that can mediate between economic growth and social development. Okay? That it is no good for governments to speak of inclusive growth in the form of transfer payments or in the form of populist schemes. It is about creating employment. And the reason why these high rates of growth have not been translated into a corresponding reduction in poverty, which they were, by the way, in the 1970s and the 1980s, for what it is worth, is because increments in output have been distributed very unequally. High rates of growth have been associated with rising inequality, so that poverty reduction, although it is there, it is simply not commensurate. And we can debate the numbers on poverty, but the real issue is that there are two poverty lines. The critical minimum, what was Arjun Sen Gupta's 12 rupees per capita per day in 2004 prices, and something just above, which provides for not just nutrition, but healthcare, education, shelter. Now, the proportion of people between the two poverty lines in India is as much as 40% of our population. And half the world's poor, below $2 people per day, live in India. Just as we are seeing evidence of growing inequality, we can see it in the distribution of consumption expenditure that underestimates inequality. We can see it in the distribution of national income between wages and profits. We can see it in the emergence of the super rich and the ultra rich in terms of the share of the richest 1% in national income, which is now estimated to be 15%, according to Atkinson and Associates in 2008 in India. Okay, let me now turn, and in response to what the chairman said at the outset, let's think about solutions. And I think if you're going to address these persistent and mounting crises in India, employment must become the focus of macroeconomic policies. governors of central banks and their performance should be judged not on rates of inflation. Finance ministers should not be judged on rates of inflation or fiscal balances, but they should be judged in terms of what's happening to employment and growth. That was the principal macroeconomic objective in the past. Okay, very briefly, in the last part of what I have to talk about, let me turn to the quiet, almost silent crisis of the Indian economy. Now, I must say, both surprised and somewhat distressed to hear T.N. Nainan, whom I respect greatly, say that there is no crisis in Indian agriculture. And that is, in a sense, the tragedy of our times. There is a crisis, and yet there is so little cognition of it in the public discourse. To the pink pages of our newspapers, it is farmer suicides occasionally, it is the Maoist problem occasionally, often portrayed as law and order problems. Now, these are symptoms of a much deeper malaise. And Indira Gandhi, for all her flaws and warts, recognized long time ago, early in her reign, that there was a deep crisis in Indian agriculture, which was sought to be addressed. But the present dispensation seems to think that the agricultural sector does not exist, or if it exists, it does not matter. The reality is that now about 14% of GDP comes from the agricultural sector. But the agricultural sector still employs directly or indirectly more than 2/3 our population. So GDP per capita in agriculture is so much lower than the non-agricultural sector. What is more, people in the agricultural sector have almost no social opportunities. So that it's not that their share of output, it's their share of possible increments in output that is very small. Infrastructure, you know, there is a problem that we have with physical infrastructure, power, roads, transport, ports, communication. There's a problem that we have with social infrastructure, education, healthcare, sanitation, even drinking water. Now, if we compare expenditure on physical infrastructure and on social infrastructure as a proportion of GDP in India, it is amongst the lowest in the world. Some sub-Saharan African countries have higher proportions allocated, admittedly of lower GDP, to that. Now, the ideological belief in the magic of markets has led to a premature withdrawal of the state from public investment in infrastructure, but private investment, whether domestic or foreign, has simply not been forthcoming. And the public-private partnerships, I think, seem to be a figment of the Planning Commission's imagination. Nothing real has emerged. But we cannot contemplate a world in India either of economic growth or of human development unless we address this problem of infrastructure. Education, I've spent my lifetime in it. The education crisis runs deep. You know, there's excellence in islands, but it does not add up to a continent of excellence. And in two sentences, I think what we have in terms of educational opportunities is simply not enough. And even what we have is not good enough. Whether we look at primary education, secondary education, vocational education, higher education, professional education, every domain. Now, this has been written about, this has been thought about, there are blueprints galore, but for the past 10 years, the government has done precious little but rent-seeking and state patronage in the world of education. And last but not least, my quiet crisis in the economy, and I will stop, Chairman, with this, is about industrialization. There was this morning some mention of it by N.K. Singh, that this is a crisis. Now, you know, the founding fathers of the Republic created the initial conditions and laid the essential foundations for industrialization. Essentially, the Nehruvian view of the world, whether it was infrastructure or capital goods or science, technology, government support, it unleashed an enormous potential for industrialization. And in the early 1970s and in the early 1980s, even before liberalization began, we saw some of the benefits of this investment in terms of learning to industrialize. Okay? But what we have witnessed since 1990 is a cause for concern. In 1990, the share of manufacturing in total output, or GDP, was close to 18%. In 2010, it's 14%. India desperately needs to industrialize, to mobilize its most abundant resource, people, through employment creation. The entrepreneurship exists, the skills exist. Manufacturing would drive productivity increase elsewhere in the economy. It would lead to skill spillovers, linkages, externalities. Above all, it would enable India to use its low wages to compete in world markets. It is where our comparative advantage lies. And it would also unleash India's enormous potential in spite of the world of cronyism that we live in terms of managerial capabilities and technological capabilities. The tragedy is that we have let it go. You know, I said this and I stand corrected, that we, in 2012-13, we imported $5 billion worth of mobile phones. We are the largest growing and largest market for mobile telephony in the world. So economies of scale are there for taking. And yet, the best we do is assembly. Our imports of consumer electronics and components in 12-13 were $40 billion US. It's not rocket science. Import substitution is possible. Smaller countries who came later to industrialization than we did are in this business. But this will not happen with the magic of markets. And once again, in response to the chairman's question, I think it is time to develop a strategic plan for infrastructure in India, to develop a strategic plan for what is to be done in agriculture. And after all, the Green Revolution came from such strategic thinking. It had many other adverse consequences, but it had many positive consequences too. It's time to plan for the spread of education in society, because there will be no demographic dividend to reap unless we address this question and create capabilities amongst our young people. And last but not least, you know, the deindustrialization will proceed on this course unless we evolve a strategic industrial policy, which is combined with a strategic trade policy and a strategic technology policy. Now, none of this is going to happen on its own. And it is certainly not going to happen if it is left to the marketplace, which is the ideology of our times. All of this is going to require proactive engagement of the government, every sphere I have mentioned. And therefore, if we have to address the economy and its crises, we are going to have to address the polity and its crisis, because politics will remain in command. But I have focused my comments on the economy. Thank you.